The impetus for this presentation, for this discussion, is the recent election and the election results. And I'm really going to be focused on the insights that we can gain from complexity science about what's going on. I've been talking about the issue of the issues that we've been talking about for years. So many of you who have heard presentations before will recognize some of the material. At the same time, there are definitely some new twists and insights that are not just driven by the recent election, but by things that have been developing over the last few years. So I'm actually looking forward to talking about them and to hearing your questions and discussing some of the new insights that have been gained through watching what's been happening over the last few years. Okay, so I want to give the bottom line conclusion up front. The bottom line conclusion is that we cannot rely on the existing systems, the systems that we've been relying on for decades, to provide the kind of context for society that enables people to be safe and many other things. And the solution to societal problems and crises lies in creating network systems for decision making. This is something, again, that we've been talking about for years, but the dynamics and the specifics of what's happening are making this more clear. Though I want to be careful in saying that the manifestation of this is not, again, just in the recent election, and it's not even in the actual election results. It is in the overall dynamics of what's happening in the world. One of the things that's important to mention is that leadership changes don't fix systemic problems. The systemic problems have to do with the structure of the system. If there are systemic problems, they're not going to be addressed by a leadership change. So let me go ahead and talk about complexity science in a sentence. Complexity science is about understanding how pieces work together, and the dependencies between them give rise to all kinds of interesting things happening. And so this is kind of the focus of what we're talking about now. I want to show this video of a flock of sterlings, which we often use to introduce complexity science. Just watch the birds for a few moments. The question really at stake is, how do we understand this behavior? How do we describe it and characterize it scientifically? These questions are rooted in the fact that what we're looking at is a set of individual entities. These are birds, these are sterlings, that we see almost just as points. And I want you to watch this last part of it to see better the individual. And obviously, to understand the dynamics of what's going on, we need to learn about this system in a specific or different way than we often study other scientific systems that science studies. Here is, we can do the same thing for people. This is Twitter back when it was Twitter, dynamics of people's sending tweets. This is global messages also sent through Twitter. And again, we can observe and think about the dynamics of the global communication process. Now, to think about these things, we need actually quite fundamentally new mathematical, conceptual, and other tools. Some of them are described without math in the book, Making Things Work. And there's a textbook, Dynamics of Complex Systems, that provides a deeper dive. I'm going to, the presentation today cannot talk about the details of analyses, but the purpose of this is to talk about some of the concepts and conclusions that we can infer, and to discuss them in a context where the real challenges that we're facing in society can become manifest. So I want to talk about the issue of complexity itself and its relationship to success individually and organizationally. And this is going to form a substantial part of the presentation, and then I'll have another part that's going to be about patterns and its relationship to conflict and other things. We need to mute one of the participants. Can we do that? Okay, good. So the first concept that I want to talk about is this multiscale understanding. And I'm just going to use this picture of a mountain and a valley to illustrate this idea. If we look at the picture carefully, we see that the picture is formed out of pixels. Each of the pixels has a single color. But what we can do is we can look at the upper left was the original picture. And as we go to the right and then down to the left and then over to the right, what we're doing is we're coarsening the resolution so that we see less and less of the details. And progressively here again, we see less and less of the details until we lose much of the image. Now, the idea here is that when we want to understand systems, there have been developed these two pictures. Upper left is statistics, where we would think about random motions of entities. And on the upper right is a ballistic motion to collective motion. It's all of the things moving together in the same direction. Those simplified pictures, which we use progressively in statistics and calculus, are not going to address our understanding or give us an understanding of the flock of birds that we talked about. And so the major tool that is really important to use is this multiscale understanding that I illustrated using the picture of the mountain and the valley. The second concept that I want to talk about is a complexity profile. So I'm going to introduce the word complexity, but what I'm going to do so is in a multiscale context. So complexity, which is the vertical axis here, is the amount of information I need to describe a system. And if you think in terms of the flock of birds or the mountain, we know that as we reduce the resolution, we locally aggregate the system, we remove information or we reduce the information, we have less and less information. So what we have is the horizontal axis is the size, the number of things that are moving together. And again, the vertical is the amount of information. So if we look on the left at the extent of this complexity profile, we end up with the amount of information and all the details. Whereas if we go to the right, we're looking at the large behaviors of the system, i.e. the collective behaviors of the system. So if we think about complexity and scale, complexity is the amount of information, and the complexity of a specific system is different at different scales, with the amount of information going down as we reduce the level of details that we see in the problem. The next idea that I want to talk about is Ashby's law. Now, Ashby's law can be thought about in the context of a very complex computer game. And basically, if we take a player and the game and we compare them, then we can actually contrast the complexity of the player with the complexity of the computer game. And I'm sure many of you can imagine what happens if you have a super complex computer game. It's impossible to win it. And the formal statement of this is that the complexity of the player has to exceed the complexity of the computer game in order for the player to win. And conversely, if the game is more complex than the player cannot win the game. So this I can just say here, in this, what I've just said, if the player has a higher complexity than the game, then the player can win. And if the game has higher complexity, then the player cannot win. And this is a fundamental law that has been that Ashby articulated about 70 years ago. Now, this is relevant to people in society, which is a key thing that we want to work with, which is that if an individual has a complexity which is higher than the societal demands, then the person can survive. If a person has lower complexity, the person cannot survive. And there's a characteristic complexity of individuals that is important in this context. And in a situation where complexity is increasing over time, we can understand that people will have greater and greater difficulty to engage successfully with the society around us. Now, I want to transfer this idea to the issue of organizations. And the reason why this is important is that we are actually focusing on institutional complexity in this presentation. What is the ability of an organization in the context of society? And if we look at the traditional structure of organizations, which has been the dominant structure of organizations historically for thousands of years, in such an organization, there is an individual, a single individual, which is responsible for a significant aspects of the organization as a whole. But what we know from what we've just said is that with a single individual responsible for an organization, the individual's complexity limits the ability of the organization to respond to the environment. So to the extent that an individual is in control of the organization behavior, to that extent, the individual cannot, the organization doesn't have a complexity greater than an individual. And that is a problem in exactly the context that we talked about, that the complexity of society is rising over time. If we contrast this with a network, there are many, many things that we can and should say about networks. But one thing that is true is that a network's overall complexity is not limited by the complexity of the individual. We can construct networks that will be more complex than the behavior of an individual. And so this leads to this picture, which is something that, again, I've been talking about for many years, where if we look at the complexity of civilization over time and the organizations that have been developed over time, we see that there is a time to be expected where the complexity of the collective of organizations will exceed that of an individual, and that will coincide with the societal complexity being higher than the complexity of an individual. And this, according to analysis that I've presented for years, is something that happened several decades ago, starting in the 80s and progressively increasing since then. And so what that means is that we should be seeing a transition, a natural transition, to networked organizational structures that will be able to address the complexity of the society around us. That sounds very nice. We will have this smooth transition, which it seems to illustrate, to a higher complexity systems that are networked organizational structures. Now, I want to say that transitions in general are not always so smooth. They're characterized by tremendous fluctuations and therefore disruptions of the organizational behavior. So we shouldn't really expect it to be very smooth. At the same time, given that we're experiencing this now, which we've talked about for decades, learning from what's happening around us is important. And I have some things to say about this that I don't think were very well anticipated. Before I go to that, because our focus in some sense, in the background, is on the election, I want to talk about the issue of democracy and voting. And this is a very challenging statement to make because we know, even though democracy is an important system that is supposed to replace autocracies and other systems like communism and so on, and provide better, more effective governance, that a representative democracy is basically a system where individuals make one decision periodically to put someone in central control. That's not a non-centrally controlled system. It's not a network. It's still a centrally controlled system. And in fact, um, the voting process itself is a very oversimplified dynamic of of um, combining people into making decisions. It fails to integrate and leverage the diverse strengths and capabilities of individuals, which is not manifestly not a very effective way of achieving high complexity decisions. In fact, if we characterize the complexity of a voting system, its complexity is quite low. So the traditional view of this democracy versus other governance structures process, we are saying that the scientific analysis of the system suggests that there is another system that is going to be much more effective, which is a collective of diverse individuals that is capable of better aggregating its decision-making processes. So I want to go back now, however, and I'm going to go to questions and answers for this section in a few moments. And I'm sure there are many questions about this, and we'll take the time to discuss them. There were several really key observations that led to the understanding that we were at the transition point in going towards distributed control systems. And one of them was the breakup of the Soviet Union. And another one was the distributed control processes in corporations that were giving up central control in favor of management processes, like in, total quality TQM and re-engineering the organization and many other management processes that their essential role was to distribute decision making. What I want to do is to say today we are seeing a resurgence of effort to restore the Soviet Union. We're seeing individuals with high-profile names being a banner CEOs and owners of organizations. And we're also seeing political and economic powers that are gaining control over the public through the press, which is a centrally controlled process. And this is manifest. And so the question is, how does this correspond to the analysis that we've done? And what I want to say about this, and again, we'll talk about this in a moment in questions, is that there is an alternative to this adaptation to the environmental complexity, which is actually to reduce the complexity of the environment. And we see manifest actions that are happening to do this, right? We see armies that are flattening the environment and the cities of conflict, enabling armies that are acting at low complexity to be successful in a context of warfare. We're seeing companies eliminating competition by monopolization. And again, without the competition, the environmental complexity is, of course, dramatically reduced. And this fact that political and economic powers can influence the public means that the complexity for the powers, whether economic or social, is reduced. So the framing that we're seeing happening in the counter competition here by hierarchical organizations is that there is a simplification of the environment by the system. It's as if the player now has the ability to change the game in such a way that the complexity is reduced to the point that they are able to play the game. But the caveat of all of this, of course, is that those systems are not able to address the complex challenges, either internal or external, of society. So even though they're able to maintain power in this context, that doesn't mean that they're able to address the challenges that need to be addressed for a functioning society. So, for example, pandemics, including the COVID pandemic, has not been addressed. The climate change has not been addressed. Poverty, conflict, many other challenges of society that could be addressed by a more complex decision-making process are not being addressed effectively by the society. And of course, if we have the centrally controlled systems, then the motivations of leaders, which has always been a challenge societally, are not aligned with the public good, are not necessarily. So what we have is we have this competition. There should, according to the earlier discussion, have been a smooth transition, or there should be a smooth transition to networked organizational structures that can deal with the complexity that hierarchies cannot. Instead, we're seeing a manifest competition among hierarchical organizations and implicitly with networked organizations that could be more functional and replace their abilities. So I want to just do this summary and then we'll take questions. And again, I do have a second part to the presentation, but let's take questions first. So again, corporations can shift either to distributed control or to monopolization. In the former, they are changing structure. In the latter, they're changing the environment in which they operate. The second statement is that governance is failing to meet the challenges of society. This is true regardless of who is in power. There could, of course, be individuals who are much better or worse. That's not something that we are going to argue about. But regardless, in solving the problems that people need solutions for, this is not the solution to the problem. And more specifically, or more generally than just governance systems, which are public good systems are unable to adapt and need to be replaced. And the reason is that there is no natural dynamics in the existing system for replacement of public good systems that are not working well. And so we need to go outside of the standard dynamical process in order to build effective public good and other systems. So I want to talk about a topic which we'll call patterns of conflict and cooperation. And I'm going to start with just pattern formation. So a pattern formation is you have a system that has different things going on in different places. There's a structure of the activity, so it's not the same everywhere. Instead of different things going on in different places. And this is an example. This is just a study that we did of individuals that were engaged in particular topics in publications. And each dot represents an individual, and those that were following each other on a social media, Twitter again years ago, are pulled together, and those that are not are pushed apart. And what we see is that there is a societal structure that separates, and I don't have a pointer here for some reason, that separates people who are interested in local news versus people who are interested in the global news, And then there is the political division between liberals and conservatives and other individuals who are interested in national news, other types of news. Okay? So this shows this kind of fragmentation of society through association and through influence. And so these are the mechanisms of pattern formation, association bringing people together that have presumably similar views, and influence among them that shifts them so that they have same, and influence can somehow cause people to have difference of opinions. But the whole pattern forming process ends up creating this kind of pattern structure. Now, what I want to do, if I can get there, is talk about this in the context of conflict, which is kind of apparent. And then I'm going to talk about this in the context of cooperation as an alternative model. And this is where we're going to get to this conflicted election process. And what do we do about making elections more effective in terms of voting processes? And I want to talk about that. So here is the situation. In the top part, the horizontal axis here is different positions, different views. So it ranges from left to right in a standard political spectrum. And what we have is we have different groups. Sorry, in the top one, we just have a standard model of population opinions where there is a center that's the peak, and then it tails off in each direction. And in the top part, if you run a vote, then the one who's closest to the middle would win. In the bottom one, you have two peaks. So you have two different opinions that are separated from each other. This is a polarized population. And what happens in this case if you run a vote? And the answer is, if everyone votes, then the one who's closest to the middle wins. And the reason that happens, if you look at it, is the red one gets all of the ones to the right, and the blue one gets all of the ones to the left of the middle between them, and the one that's closest to the middle will win. Is it clear? So that tends to push people towards the middle in elections. And that's one of the ideas that has been driving political narratives for a long time. Being close to the middle wins. But it turns out that if some people abstain from voting because their opinions are far away from the people who they would vote for, then this is no longer true. And on the left, you have the case of a single peak, where indeed you still have the one next to the middle wins. But on the right, where you have a polarized population, the white areas are the people who didn't vote because they said, nah, I don't agree with that person. Even though they're closer to me than the other person, then under those circumstances, the person who is close to the peak of the one of the distribution, one of the polarized parts will win. Is it clear? You've heard of it, right? So there's actually a model for this, and I won't go into the details of the model, but what I want to do is show you that this completely agrees with what's been happening in the US in terms of the polarization of the population. So the blue jagged line and the red jagged line are based upon the political platforms of the parties. And what we see is that as of 1970s, the population is split into two polarized parts. And now we have an oscillation between voting for one or voting for the other, but no matter who is voted for, they're not representative of the population. Is it clear? So how do you solve this problem? I was asked in one of the questions, and the answer is if you do ranked choice voting, it helps. Of course, if you require everyone to vote, it helps. There are many different changes in the electoral process that would solve this problem, and there is some efforts in order to make this happen. But I want to talk about a different approach completely. I want to talk about the approach of cooperation. And in order to explain cooperation, I'm just going to take the generic situation where pattern formation gives rise to cooperation. And this is in a developmental process. So this is a developmental process of a fetus. It's a mouse, but that's not the detail that matters here. A mouse starts out with cells that have exactly the same behavior, exactly the same, if you like, opinions. And over time, there's differentiation into tissues, organs, and so organ systems that function together in a cooperative sense. And why do they function together in a cooperative sense? Is because of this interplay between the differentiation process and the existence of different functions that can be served by different types of behavioral patterns. Now, saying this leads to this idea that in principle, differentiation could be functional. And again, I'm not talking, I don't want to enter into the specific conflicts between particular groups, but the existence of the idea of differences in group behavior, similar to differences in individual behavior, can give rise to collective strength by assuming that there are diverse roles that different parts of the system can serve. Now, this is something that maybe have to become clear over time, but the idea is that this is an alternative fundamental perspective to conflict and the imperative to control. In other words, if one group is not agreeing with the other group, one of the solutions is to say, okay, you do you and we'll do us, and we won't tell each other what to do. And that becomes an opportunity for collaboration rather than power-based competition. Now, this would require an essential shift. And I'm saying this very clearly because it's a difficult thing to really think about in some cases. But under these circumstances, we remove this possibility of telling the others what to do. Instead, you can help them and they can help us, but they can't tell us what to do and we can't tell them what to do. And that may be difficult to accept, but that's the alternative when we're talking about cooperation in this context. Now, I want to give one more statement about this, which is, manifest, or people can understand as being manifest in this context as it's manifest in many contexts historically. And that is that there's a third aspect of conflict under fragmentation. And that is that conflict under fragmentation can and often socially is a result of a defeat, is a divide and conquer or divide and rule strategy. And by creating cooperation among divergent groups, one may be able to undermine this strategy, which undermines the ability to achieve societal good. In other words, the divide and rule strategy, which you can look up historically, as Machiavelli talked about, Lao Tzu talked about it, there are many historical examples that are really known that this was the strategy, is that strategy will individuals in power seek to control by virtue of creating antagonisms among groups within the population in order to avoid what? In order to avoid the effect of disaffection from those who are in positions of power. And so conflict today in society can or may be, and there's a lot of evidence that it is, also a diversion from the underlying challenges of society, which are not being addressed by the system, including poverty and disaffection from those in power. And poverty is among the problems. And again, I gave a link. You can look at our analysis of it. It's not that difficult to understand. Poverty can be solved, but it's not being addressed. And the reason that it's not being addressed is linked also to the fact that there is a conflict in society which is not enabling a collective action that would address this issue. So this is one part of this last piece of my presentation. I want to talk about one more piece, and that's the ethics. Ethics has become, let's say, a topic of discourse and manifest in society, where people who are in positions of authority or in power or seeking power, whatever, there are issues with the ethics of their behavior. And all I want to do is point out that by natural understanding, it doesn't require very great sophistication. When there isn't adequate rule of law, then there is tremendous success due to ethics violation. This is obvious because of two reasons. One, which may be first order, is that ethics violations, the reason why they're violation of ethics is that they give benefits while hurting others to individuals. And the second is that when we talked about Ashby's law and complexity, if you eliminate the constraint of not doing ethics violations, then it increases the variety of things that you can do, which enables you to deal with more complex environments. Regardless of which it is, it's very clear that social consequences, i.e. rule of law and other social consequences, causes ethics of individuals who are successful to be positive, right? They're engaged in ethical behavior. Absence of rule of law or social consequences leads to individuals who are empowered to have low ethics. And under circumstance where the societal systems are not limiting behavior, what you end up with is removing the constraints and having unethical people be the generic ones who are in positions of power. This is obviously not great, but here is, again, the same solution that we talked about before by creating collective networks of action is also a solution to this problem. And the reason should be clear. If an individual's success is not actually due to an individual, but due to the collective of action, then the collective action has to be, essentially by definition, collective. And the collective ethics fundamentally has to be collective in the sense that we've talked about. It shifts, surely it shifts this issue of ethics and the success outcome. So let me summarize in this context. Now I'll just do a summary of the whole discussion. Complexity rising, i.e. the societal complexity increasing, is causing problems for central control. Central control systems are battling over power. The solution for us, as far as we're concerned, in terms of public good and so on, is to create collective network systems that restore collective good, but also by definition, if you look at complexity analysis, they differentiate function across a society. And so this is consistent with what we've been talking about. This was the original summary that I made. We cannot rely on the existing systems. This is a super powerful statement because if we cannot rely on the existing systems to provide for us essential safety and essential structures, then we better do something and do it soon. And that's what we've been talking about. The second thing is that for those of you who are interested in complexity science, this is a tool. It's a framework for understanding and analyzing these systems. And just to be clear, complexity science is not a well-tilled field. It is something that is still early in its development. There's a lot of potential for scientific exploration and contribution. And if you're interested, there are courses that we are offering that would enable you to start getting deeper into this and participating. And finally, I mentioned before, we ourselves, by force of current context, and trust me, I didn't expect that we would be doing this. I was pretty much thinking that the smooth transition would work, but it's clear that it isn't. But in the context of a non-smooth transition, we really have to step up and figure out what we can do in order to make these systems that will enable us to achieve effective public good institutions.